History of Photography. Hi, I'm Wade Carmichael, and I'm an instructor with the Apex Parks and Recreation and Cultural Resources Department. Photo equals light, graphy equals drawing. Created from the Greek roots photos, genitive of phos for light, and graphy, representation by means of lines or drawing. In a world of scholarly Latin and Greek, it was inevitable that several people would use the same new term to describe the process. Hercule Florence, a French painter and inventor, used the French form, photographie, in private notes believed written in 1834. Photography is the science, art, application, and practice of creating durable images by recording light or other electromagnetic radiation, either electronically by means of an image sensor or chemically by means of a light-sensitive material, such as photographic film. Sir John Herschel is sometimes credited for coining the word and introducing it to the public. Use of it in his correspondence prior to February 1839, as well as his March 14 lecture before the Royal Society in London on that subject, documents that. However, Berlin astronomer Johann von Mädler used the term photography in a 25 February article in the German newspaper Vossische Zeitung that same year, challenging that assertion. There were cameras before photography. The camera obscura, used for drawing, combined several technical discoveries long before the first photographs were made. Han Dynasty Chinese philosopher Mo Dai, from the Moist school of logic, was among the first to observe and develop the scientific principles of optics, camera obscura, and the pinhole camera. Later, Greek mathematicians Aristotle and Euclid also described a pinhole camera in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, before the current era. In the 6th century current era, Byzantine architect mathematician Artemius of Thrace used a variation of the camera obscura in his experiments. He even got a coin stamped in his honor. Both the Han Chinese polymath Shen Kuo and Arab physicist Ibn al-Haytham independently invented the camera obscura and pinhole camera. Shen Kuo explains the science of camera obscura and optical physics in his scientific work, Dream Pool Essays. Later, Albertus Magnus discovers silver nitrate, and later still, George Fabricius discovers silver chloride. Silver becomes a very important thing in photography. The techniques described in Ibn al-Haytham's Book of Optics are capable of producing primitive photographs using medieval materials. Daniel Bavaro described a diaphragm, an adjustable aperture, in 1566. Wilhelm Homburg described how light darkened some chemicals in 1694. The fiction book Gifanti, published in 1760 by French author Trifègne de la Roche, described what can be interpreted as photography. Leonardo da Vinci mentions natural camera obscura that are formed by dark caves on the edge of a sunlit valley. A hole in the cave wall will act as a pinhole camera and project a laterally reversed upside-down image on a piece of paper or the far wall of the cavern. So the birth of photography was primarily focused on finding and inventing a means to capture and keep the image provided by the camera obscura. Here we have a natural camera obscura in a structure that casts the light on the far wall of a staircase. Renaissance painters used the camera obscura, which in fact gives the optical rendering in full color that dominates Western art. Camera obscura literally means dark chamber in Latin. It is a box with a hole in it which allows light to go through and create an image on the opposite wall of the chamber. Simple. The earliest known surviving heliographic or sun-graphic engravings dates from 1825, printed from a metal plate made by Nicéphore Niepce. The plate was exposed under an ordinary engraving and copied by photographic means. This was a step toward the first photograph taken with a camera. Around 1800, British inventor Thomas Wedgwood captured the first known image in a camera obscura using light-sensitive substance. Using paper or white leather, sometimes known as parchment, treated with silver nitrate, he had succeeded in capturing shadows of objects placed on the surface in direct sunlight, and even made shadow copies of paintings on glass. It was reported in 1802 that the images formed by means of a camera obscura have been found too faint to produce, in any moderate time, an effect upon the nitrate of silver. The shadow images eventually darkened all over. If you own silver, you know the effect. As stated earlier, the first permanent photo etching was produced in 1822 by the French inventor Nicéphore Niepce, but it was destroyed in an attempt to make prints from it. In 1825, Niepce was successful. In 1826 or 27, he made the View from the Window at Le Gras, the earliest surviving photograph from nature. Niepce's camera photographs required extremely long exposures, from 8 hours to several days. He worked to improve his bitumen process or replace it with one more practical. Collaborating with Louis Daguerre, post-exposure processing methods that produced visually superior results and replaced the bitumen with a more light-sensitive resin were developed. But hours of exposure in the camera were still required. With an eye to eventual commercial exploitation, the partners opted for total secrecy. When Niepce died in 1833, Daguerre redirected his experiments toward the light-sensitive silver halides abandoned by Niepce many years earlier, because his images were not light-fast and permanent. Daguerre's work culminated in what would later be named Daguerreotype process, a silver-plated surface sensitized with iodine vapor, developed using mercury vapor, and fixed with hot saturated salt water, was effected in 1837. Exposure time was reduced to minutes instead of hours. Daguerre took the earliest confirmed photograph of a person in 1838 while capturing a view of a Paris street. While other pedestrians and horse-drawn traffic on the busy boulevard is unseen, one man, having his boots polished, was captured. He stood sufficiently still throughout the several-minute-long exposure to not become a blur if even visible. Daguerre's process was publicly announced without details on 7 January of 1839. The news created an international sensation. France agreed to pay Daguerre a pension for the right to present his invention to the world as the gift of France, when complete instructions were released on August 19, 1839. American photographer Robert Cornelius is credited with taking the earliest surviving photographic self-portrait that same year. The first selfie. Hercules Florence had started working in Brazil on a silver salted-based paper process in 1832, naming it Photographic. And British inventor William Fox Talbot had succeeded in making crude but reasonably light-fast silver images on paper as early as 1834. He too kept his work secret. With publication of Daguerre's invention in January of 1839, Talbot was spurred to publish his method and set about improving it. Like other pre-Daguerreotype processes, Talbot's paper-based photography required exposure over hours. He created the Collodion process in 1840, using a chemical development of the latent image to reduce exposure time, thereby competing with the Daguerreotype. Unlike Daguerre's, Talbot's process created translucent negatives, which could be used to print multiple positive copies in both original and Collodion forms. Replication is the basis of most modern chemical photography. Daguerreotypes could only be replicated by rephotographing them with a camera, or multiple cameras taking one shot each of the same subject. Talbot's tiny paper negative or oriel window in Lecoq Abbey is one of a number of photographs he made in the summer of 1835, possibly the oldest existing camera negative. British chemist John Herschel made many contributions to the new field. He invented the cyanotype process, which many recognize as the blueprint. He was the first to use the terms photography, negative, and positive, and discovered sodium thiosulfate was a solvent of silver halides in 1819. He informed Talbot and Daguerre that it could fix silver halide, making it light fast. The first glass negative is made in late 1839. In the March 18 issue of The Chemist, Frederick Scott Archer published his wet plate collodion process. It became the most widely used photographic medium until it was replaced by the gelatin dry plate, introduced in the 1870s. There are three applications of the collodion process. The ambrotype is a positive image on glass. The ferrotype or tintype is a positive image on metal, and the glass negative used to make positive prints on albumen or salted paper. Matthew Brady. Brady, most well known for his photo chronicle of the American Civil War, began as a student of portrait painting under William Page at age 16. In 1839, the two studied with Samuel F.B. Morse of ... fame, who had met Daguerre in France in 1839. Morse then set out to promote the new Daguerreotype. At that time, Brady made the leather cases for Morse Daguerreotypes. He was soon at the center of the New York artistic colony exploration of photography. Morse opened a studio and offered classes. Brady was one of the first students. By 1844, Brady had his own photography studio in New York, and in 1845 he began to exhibit his portraits of famous Americans, including the likes of Senator Daniel Webster and poet Edgar Allan Poe. In 1849, he opened a studio in Washington, D.C. Matthew Brady takes photography to war. While Brady's early images were daguerreotypes, ambrotype photography became popular in the 1850s, which was eclipsed by the albumin print, a paper photograph produced from a large glass negative. Brady would take that technology on the road to capture scenes of the American Civil War. Glass plates dominate camera photography from the late 1850s until the 1890s, when flexible plastic film is introduced. The convenience of film popularized amateur photography, but early films cost more and were of lower optical quality than glass plates. Until the late 1910s, large format preferred by professionals was not available in film. The new medium did not immediately or completely replace the old. The superior dimensional stability of glass was well suited to scientific applications such as astrophotography into the 1990s. And the niche field of laser holography still favors glass. Film photography. Herder and Dreffield pioneered work on light sensitivity emulsions in 1876. Their work enabled first quantitative measure of film speed. The first flexible photographic roll film was marketed by George Eastman in 1885. The film was actually a coating on a paper base. In processing, the image-bearing layer was stripped from the paper and transferred to a hardened gelatin support. The first transparent plastic roll film followed in 1889. It was made from highly flammable nitrocellulose, now referred to as nitrate film. Cellulose acetate, or safety film, was introduced by Kodak in 1908. At first, only a few special applications used it as an alternative to hazardous nitrate film, which was tougher, more transparent, and cheaper. The switch was not completed for X-ray films until 1933, and while safety film was always used for 16 and 8mm home movies, nitrate film was used for theatrical 35mm motion pictures until 1951. The roll on the right lower corner is nitrate film that has begun to seep out little droplets of nitroglycerin. Films remained dominant form of photography until the early 21st century, when advances in digital photography drew consumers to digital formats. Although modern photography is dominated by digital users, film continues to be used by enthusiasts and professional photographers. The distinctive look of film based on photographs compared to digital images is likely due to a combination of factors, including differences in spectral and tonal sensitivity with film versus linear response curve for digital sensors, resolution, and continuity of tone. Black and white. In the beginning, all photography was monochrome, light or dark. Black and white has become the generic reference, as many early photos were neither. After color film was readily available, black and white photography continued its dominance for decades, as its lower cost and classic look prevailed. Tones and contrast of light and dark areas define black and white photography. Monochromatic pictures are not necessarily composed of pure black, white, or shades of gray. They can be shades of a single hue determined by process. The cyanotype, for example, produces an image composed of blue tones. The albumin print process, first used more than 170 years ago, produces brownish tones, what we refer to as sepia, and a setting you can have in your camera. Here we have the first color photograph made by the three-color method suggested by James Clerk Maxwell in 1855. It was taken in 1861 by Thomas Sutton. The subject is a colored ribbon. Color photography was explored beginning in the 1840s. Early experiments in color required extremely long exposure of hours or days, and it could not fix the photograph to the color from quickly fading when exposed to white light. Color photography appeared long before Kodachrome, as this 1903 portrait by Sarah Angelina Ackland demonstrates. In its infancy, the need for special equipment, long exposures, and complicated printing processes made it extremely rare. This image of a bay shows the water as glassy smooth, because the waves have all been fuzzed out by the time exposure. Russian photographer Sergei Mikhailovich Prokudin-Gorsky made extensive use of color separation technique, employing a special camera which successively exposed the three color filtered images on different parts of an oblong plate. Because his exposures were not simultaneous, unsteady subjects exhibited color fringes, or, if moving through the scene, appeared as brightly colored ghosts in the resulting projected or printed images. Implementation of color photography was hindered by the limited sensitivity of early photographic materials, which were mostly sensitive to blue, only slightly sensitive to green, and virtually insensitive to red. The discovery of dye sensitization by photochemist Hermann Vogel in 1873 suddenly made it possible to add sensitivity to green, yellow, and even red. Improved color sensitizers and ongoing improvements in the overall sensitivity of emulsions steadily reduced the once prohibitive long exposure times required for color, bringing it ever closer to commercial viability. In 1907, the Lumiere brothers introduced the first commercially successful color process, Autochrome. Autochrome plates used a mosaic color filter layer of dyed grains of potato starch, with color components to be recorded as adjacent microscopic image fragments. Autochrome plates were reversal processed to produce a positive transparency. The starch grains illuminated each fragment with the correct color. The tiny colored points blend in the eye, synthesizing the color of the subject additively, as does contemporary video screens. Autochrome plates were one of many additive color screen plates and films marketed between the 1890s and the 1950s. Kodak introduced the first modern integral tripack or monopack color film in 1935, Kodachrome. It captured the three colors in a multi-layer emulsion. One layer was sensitized to red, another to green, and a third to blue. Without special processing, the result would be three superimposed black-white images, but complementary cyan, magenta, and yellow dyes, yielding the desired colors. Images were created in those layers by adding color couplers during the complex processing. AGFA's similarly structured Agfacolor Nu was introduced in 1936. Unlike Kodachrome, the color couplers in Agfacolor Nu were incorporated into the emulsion layers during manufacture, which greatly simplified the processing. Currently available color films still employ a multi-layer emulsion and the same principles, most closely resembling Agfa's product. Samuel Schlafrock invented in-camera processing in 1923, but it would be Polaroid who would introduce black and white instant photography in 1948. 15 years later, instant color film used in a special camera would yield a unique finished color print only a minute or two after the exposure was introduced by Polaroid in 1963. In this cross-section, we can see the multiple layers that are necessary in order to have this process occur. And you can see sensitized halide levels, the little X's, which would become activated from exposure. And then when the film is crushed by the roller on its way out of the camera, the dye packs, which were the different layers like the red, yellow, and blue, would be squeezed into the cavities created by the halides. And the result would be your eye would perceive color from this process. A lot going on in a thin piece of film. Color photography may form images as positive transparencies, which can be used in a slide projector, or as color negatives intended for use in creating positive color enlargements on specially coated paper. The latter is now the most common form of film color photography, owing to the introduction of automated photo printing equipment. Since the transition period of 1995 to 2005, color film has become a niche market due to inexpensive multi-megapixel digital cameras. Film continues to be the preference of some photographers because of its distinctive look. In 1981, Sony unveiled the first consumer camera to use a charge-coupled device for imaging, eliminating the need for film, the Sony Mavica. While the Mavica saved images to disk, the images were displayed on a television or monitor, and the camera was not fully digital. In 1991, Kodak unveiled the DCS-100, the first commercially available digital single-lens reflex camera, although its cost precluded any but photojournalists and professional photographers. Commercial digital photography was born. Digital imaging uses an electronic image sensor to record the image as a state of electronic data rather than as chemical changes on film. An important difference between digital and chemical photography is that chemical photography resists photo manipulation because it involves film and photographic paper, while digital imaging is a highly manipulative medium. This difference allows for a degree of image post-processing that is comparatively difficult in film-based photography and permits different communicative potentials and applications. Digital photography dominates the 21st century. More than 99% of photographs taken around the world are through digital cameras, increasingly through smartphones. Synthesis photography is a part of the computer-generated imagery world, CGI, where the shooting process is modeled on traditional photography. CGI, creating digital copies of the real universe, requires a visual representation process of this universe. Synthesis photography is the application of analog and digital photography in digital space, with the characteristics of real photography, but not being constrained by the physical limits of the real world. Synthesis photography allows us to get away from real photography. The model holds the case. The artist creates the steam engine. And through synthesis, the model holds the steam engine overhead. Bonsai becomes something else altogether. The story continues. From a time when a camera was an entire room to an era where having a movable box camera was novelty took 1,200 years. From a single box to having several, and the ability to process images in the field happened in little over 30 years. 15 years later, the potential for everyone to have a camera they could hold in their hand became a possibility, though few picked it up. In another 15 years, Brownie was capturing family outings and events, but the film had to be processed by someone else, unless you were of the growing number of amateur darkroom photographers. 10 years later, the first instant camera and film put the whole process in your hand. Polaroid and Kodak would provide the lion's share of photographic experience until the late 1990s, when digital photography would usher in the ability to carry a camera in your pocket, hold thousands of images, and be able to send them around the world in a matter of seconds or minutes. Every few months, we see new advances in an image capture and presentation process, pushing the history of photography to ever higher achievement. Where do you fit in this picture?